Hi, everyone. Welcome and thanks for attending. I'm Scott at Chief Architect, and we're here today to discuss rendering techniques and best practices. Also on today's webinar are a number of Chief Architect staff to keep an eye on me and to help with your questions. I'm first going to go through my presentation, which should be just over 20 minutes. During my presentation, you can chat your questions into our staff, and then following the presentation, you can raise your hand. You'll find the option to chat and raise your hand in the GoToWebinar panel. With our session today, it will be recorded. We'll be sending out a link with a survey in there, and we greatly appreciate your feedback. And with that, let me get ready and let's switch over and begin the presentation. Welcome to the session on rendering techniques and best practices. In this session, at a summary level, I'll cover the 9 different rendering techniques Chief Architect offers to generate your 3D views. The clay rendering technique has been introduced with Chief Architect X13. I'll cover that technique in detail in the latter part of the session. I'll begin the session with a summary of our rendering techniques. Chief Architect offers 9 different rendering techniques you can use to generate your 3D views. Let's begin by creating a 3D view with the Perspective Full Overview camera. The default rendering technique is currently set to a standard view. To change the technique, choose the Rendering Technique tool in the upper toolbar. Then, on the left side of my screen, you will see the 9 different techniques. I'll enlarge the tool palette and turn on the list view so you can easily see the names. To change the rendering, you can click on the different techniques. At the bottom of the list is the Technique Options tool, where you can define the settings for each rendering style. For the vector render technique, there's a few settings you can change. One is the shadow intensity. You can slide that along and adjust it as you need to. There is opaque glass option where you can toggle that on and off. The render view can be changed in the render technique options by clicking on the style, and the render will update. I'll slide that down so we can kind of take a look at the changes with the standard technique. In the standard technique, you'll find the opaque glass setting. There are ambient light settings for the interior daytime and nighttime, and line drawing has been added where you can place this over the top. Much like the watercolor view, each one of the line drawing elements can be changed as well as the color. Again, I'll slide the dialog down and you can take a look at these settings using the standard render technique. I'll discuss the physically based and clay render styles later. The glass house gives you a translucent view. There's a few settings you can change. This is more of a wireframe setting. If you want to turn on some of the framing elements, you can see right through the design. There is the color option where you can change the color. You just tap on the color. You can make any adjustment that you want to the glass house. And then there's also the amount of transparency where you can slide this to be very transparent or the other way where it's less transparent. The line thickness, and then if you've made changes, there's a reset to defaults that will restore your settings for that view. The technical illustration view is quite similar to the vector view. You'll see patterns on your materials, and then a few settings in here for the opaque glass, a warm color, and a cold color. Each one of these can be changed, and then you can mix the blend between the two. The line thickness and then the shadow intensity can also be set up. For the watercolor technique, there are a number of settings you can use for the watercolor. I slide this up. Again, you have glass opacity where you can toggle this on and off. Some of these settings you may notice are not as dynamic as others. In some cases, when you toggle, you may need to use the update view to see the actual changes. Underneath effects, there are several settings for smooth amount, paint contrast, turbulence, pigment, and edge strength. Each one of these elements are described in further detail in our help system. As I open this up, you can see all of the effect information has been defined and how it works, as well as the rest of the components down in the dialog. Line drawing can be added over the top of the rendering. With line drawing, you can change the color, the thickness, extend, amplitude, and remember you need to click Update View in the Watercolor render technique. Let's go ahead and pull the dialog down and take a look at the rendering with Watercolor with the line drawing on top. For the line drawing technique, there's glass opacity and then the same effects for the line drawing that we just looked at for Watercolor. The bottom of the list is Duotone. Duotone, again, has glass opacity that you can turn on. There is a light and dark color, as well as the mix that you can use for desaturation tone, and then line drawing that we've been talking about with several of these techniques to create the different style. I'll slide this down so we can take a peek at the Duotone rendering technique. For the physically based render style and the clay render style, a number of changes have to be dialed in for those specific views. Let's begin with the physically based render, which also supports real-time ray tracing, provided your computer's video card meets the minimum specification for the graphical processor unit or GPU. With the physically based rendering, a few of the settings that I typically might change are the camera exposure, maybe increase that slightly. Then on the daytime backdrop intensity, I will adjust that based on the backdrop I'm using. There are settings for the color adjustment, hue, saturation, and brightness, as well as line drawing on top. And typically you want at least a minimum thickness of 2. Let me toggle the line drawing off, and then I'll go ahead and pull the dialog down so you can see the physically based rendering. This is using the real-time ray tracing option. You can still see in my dialog down here, and this is happening within seconds to create this style of render view. Again, I would refer you to a separate video to watch to show you how to dial in all the settings for your physically based rendering. Clay rendering is an abstract rendering technique that also supports real-time ray tracing. The real-time ray tracing uses the computer's video card and requires a higher-end version with a graphical processor unit or GPU. These GPUs with hardware-accelerated video cards for real-time ray tracing from NVIDIA or AMD are currently available on the Windows platform. Let's take a look at the steps to create clay renders for an exterior and interior scene. Beginning with an interior scene, I'll use the full camera tool and click and drag to create the view. The default rendering technique is currently set to the standard view. To change the rendering, choose the rendering technique tool in the top menu system and then click the clay rendering technique. To improve the quality of the rendering, I'm going to cover 4 of the 5 key steps and settings. Materials are important for rendering and are addressed in separate videos. Let's start with the camera settings. In my upper toolbar is the Edit Active View tool. In making changes to the camera settings, one of the things that I like to do for shadows is to turn on ray-casted shadows. It's going to give you a little crisper view. Reflections, not as necessary without mirrors. And then the next thing that I'm going to do is turn up the automatic lights. There are a lot of lights in this scene, and you can come in here and override the default 8 lights by typing in a value, or since this is a very large sample plan, I'm going to use a light set. Light sets are covered in a separate video, but you can create groupings of lights. I've done that in this case to create a grouping of lights for the kitchen and wine room. Next, I typically like to have a backdrop. I'm going to choose the backdrop from the backdrop panel and then browse out to the library. Then I'm going to choose one that I already have collected in my backdrops folder. Then I'm going to go ahead and close the edits for these camera settings. You may not notice much of a change or improvement in quality. Part of that is the sun is very bright. When we created the view, I did a click and drag toward the cook range, and you'll notice that I had the sun following the camera. Let me go in and make some modifications to the sun. In the upper menu system, let's click on the Adjust Lights, and then I'm going to come over and adjust the sunlight. For the clay rendering on an interior scene, I typically will use a very small number in the range of 500 for the intensity of the sun. If I want to flip the sun shadow around and have that come through the windows, you can either uncheck Sun Follows Camera and adjust the tilt angle, or you can use a sun angle with the correct latitude, longitude, as well as the time of year. You can see by changing the direction angle that the sun has flipped around and now you see the shadow. With a lower intensity on the sun, you now see the lighting effects in the scene. The next aspect of improving the rendering is to look at the technique options. Let me go ahead and open up the technique options. This is at the bottom of the techniques. Let's begin with the camera exposure. For this interior scene, I want to increase the exposure, and I found for this particular scene 0.8 will significantly brighten it. You can change the color of the rendering. Currently it is using a white color. If you click on the color, you can choose a specific solid color to use for the scene. You can also choose to use the material color, which is going to use the materials from the scene, or you can use the layer color, and I'm going to come back and explain that here in a minute. I'm going to switch this back to a solid white color and then just reset the scene. I'm also going to come back and talk about the material properties you can adjust. Lighting. If any of your lighting has different colors, if you've used a yellow or a white, you can override those light colors and then choose a specific color that you want to use in here. The clay rendering does support using ray tracing. Ray tracing does require a hardware accelerated video card if you want to use this. I'll show you in a minute in your preferences where you can find that. I like to use the ray tracing for the clay scenes. I'm going to go ahead and turn it on. And then for the daytime backdrop intensity, you might notice it's pretty dark out the window and probably out the front door behind this dialogue. I'm going to increase that to 1000. And then down toward the bottom of the dialogue, I'm going to enable line drawing on top. And you can see that the image is slowly improving. Line drawing does add quite a bit of time to generate the rendering, but you can see the effects of having the line drawing. You can choose the color, and then you can choose a number of settings from the thickness, extend, squiggle, that have been derived from the watercolor rendering technique that you may have used in the past. Let me close the dialogue and let's take a look at the scene. I mentioned you can use layers to create the colors. My layer set is currently using a 3D camera view I created without landscaping. All of the landscaping elements are turned off. If you want to create a layer set specifically and use colors and colorize the cabinets, let me show you how you might do that. In the Tools menu, I'm going to come down to Layer Sets and Layer Set Management. I'm then going to make a copy of the layer set we're using, which is the 3D camera no landscape. So let's make a copy of that, and then I'm going to give it a name of Clay 2 since I've already created one of these. At this point, the program opens up. It's made an exact copy of the layer set we were using, and you can see that the colors for all of the different layers are all black. First thing I'm going to do is select all. Then I'm going to change the color for all of these layers down here to white. Once I have all of the layers set to white, I'm then going to pick on a couple of specific layers. Let me grab the wall cabinets, and I'm going to come in here and change the color for the wall cabinets to one of my favorite blue colors. So this is the only thing in this layer set that will be using a color. At this point, I'm going to come up and I'm going to change my layer set to the new layer set we just created. You shouldn't notice any real changes because it's an exact copy of the other layer set. What I can do now is go back into my technique options, and now I'm going to choose underneath the color to use the layer color. Now remember, all of the layer colors are white with the exception of the wall cabinets. You can see them turn blue in the background, and I've done that same approach in building an additional layer set that has a very neutral light color for the wood and some of the furniture and some of the stainless steel. And if I switch my layer set to this other view, 3D camera clay, you'll see the scene refresh using those colors with a very subtle approach to that view. And since the technique option is using the layer color, you'll see a slight shading on some of the furniture, some of the floor. My doors and windows have a very light gray on them. So using this technique allows you to colorize and focus on the scene and maybe point out some of the things you want the client to see. Now let's talk about if your video card supports the real-time ray tracing. Up underneath my preferences, let's come down. There is a specific video card status. You can see hardware ray tracing is supported using this specific NVIDIA video card. Let me zoom in on the backsplash area of the scene and let's talk about a few more settings that we have. Let me go back over into the technique options, and I'll slide this dialog over to the other side so we can see what we're talking about. The first thing underneath the material is ignore the material metalness. Notice that the blender over in the corner probably has a shiny stainless steel setting on there. If I say ignore material metalness, and as the scene begins to refresh, you can see that it now takes away that property. The next one is ignore material bump or normal map. And you'll see on the backsplash there is a bump map on here that is giving a nice texture in here. If we remove that and say ignore, it's a little less subtle, but there is a small difference. If you have an ambient occlusion map, which gives a little bit of light in the texture, that will turn it off. I have some of that on the hardwood flooring. And then if there is roughness, maybe some of the hardwood has a very rough feeling, you can override that as well. So a few settings in here that, in addition to your normal material properties, you can use to further dial in your clay rendering technique. Let's go ahead and zoom out and take a look at the scene. Each of the settings we made gradually improve the scene. Your scenes may require different changes. Let me summarize the changes that were made in the scene. In the camera settings, I turned on the ray casted shadows. I turned on all the lights for both the kitchen and the wine room off to the left. Ambient inclusion was set low at 8. I did add a backdrop image. I did change the sun to 500. In the technique options, the camera exposure was set to 8. I turned on ray tracing, and then the backdrop intensity was set to 1000. For the coloring, you can use a solid color. I did create a layer set and then colorize certain layers to create the scene with just a little accent of color. And then finally I did turn on the line drawing. Let me repeat similar steps for an exterior clay rendering. Using the camera tool, I'm going to create a perspective full overview. And then I'm going to rotate around to the back and then zoom in using the wheel on my mouse. To change the rendering technique to clay, I'm going to come over and choose the clay rendering technique. You can see the intensity of the sun is washing out the view. Let's begin by changing the sun information. In the menu system, let's come into Camera View Lighting Tools and then over to Edit the Sunlight. I'll adjust the intensity of the sun down to 2000. Also, if you want to create a sun angle with specific coordinates and time of day, you can do that as well. With the sun turned down, let's go in and edit the camera settings. Up in the Edit Active View, most of these settings look pretty good. I am going to turn on the ray-casted shadows. For my exterior views, I do like to set the ambient inclusion at 0. To edit the technique options, let's come down, open up the dialog, and I'm going to make a change to the camera exposure, slightly increase that to 0.4. I'm going to change the color to use the layer color, then we'll switch it to the layer set once we close this dialog. Then I'm going to go ahead and turn on Use Ray Tracing. My backdrop daytime intensity is set to 20. That's a good number for an exterior. And then I am going to turn on line drawing to overlay over the top. Once I have these changes in place, I'm going to change the layer set that has the colorization for the different layers. And then one final change, I'm going to set the opacity for the windows and doors in the technique options. You'll find that up toward the top of the dialog. And then you can see the results using the layer set with the different colors turned on to create this style of a view. Let's recap the settings made to the scene. In the camera settings, ray-casted shadows were turned on. The sun was set to 2000. I did not have a backdrop. In the technique options, the camera exposure 0.4, ray tracing was on. The intensity of the backdrop was at 20. And for the color, I turned on the layer set with colors for a few of the layers, and then line drawing was turned on. That concludes this session on render techniques, clay rendering, and real-time ray tracing. All right. Well, welcome, and as we get ready here to take live questions, I saw several of them coming in over the chat and Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question, please just go in the GoToWebinar control panel, raise your hand, and then we'll call on you. As we call on you and you're asking questions about the rendering techniques here today, be sure to unmute your microphone, and then I'll hand it over to Carrie and see what questions that we have out there. Carrie?
Yep. Hi, Scott. We have Nikki here with a question. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Hi, Nikki.
Good, hi. So I have a question. I've been using X12 for a while, and occasionally when I'm doing a PBR rendering, I'll have some sort of item within my view. Most often it seems to be a door, a window, or the entire wall surface. But no matter what material I apply to it, it turns like this glowing white.
Okay.
I've submitted it, and the response that I've got is that it's just a known bug.
Okay.
But wondering if that is something that's going to be fixed with X13.
Yeah.
And then I have a second question about the sunlight.
Okay.
I do like setting the sun and with the longitude, latitude, and the orientation, but the sun just still feels way too bright. Is there any way to I live in Portland, so the sun here is not very intense. Is there a way to turn the intensity down while maintaining those geographical sun settings?
Okay, yeah. Well, thanks, Nikki. And let's take a look at your first question here. You're using X12. Are you using Premiere X12?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. And when you are looking at a render scene, maybe PBR, the physically based, it has a glowing effect on some surfaces.
Yeah, a lot of times it's maybe the door panel itself. Sometimes it's like the wall itself, or sometimes just like the frame and the casing of the door. But it looks like the lighting white material that's glowing,
right?
Bloom, but it's just painted white, color white.
Since X12, we have completely updated our rendering engine, and It's completely a new system. Have you downloaded the trial or even the beta version of Chief Architect X13?
I have not yet. We're kind of holding off for a few weeks just to
Yeah.
get a chance to kind of get everybody ready to transition at the same time, so we don't have some plans that can't be opened in X12
Oh
currently.
yeah.
But
What you might do, Nikki, is you might download the beta version. It's available to any customers out there that are current through the end of June. You can
okay,
download that. You're not obligated to use it on your projects, but what you could do is just open up the plan that you see this glowing effect on some of your surfaces and take a look at it. And I think that most of those items should be corrected in
okay,
the new X13. So take a look at that when you have time.
okay.
Your next question has to do with sunlight, and I'm just going to switch over here and let me go back into the floor plan view. I've got a little bit of a messy view with all my saved cameras. And if I switch this back over, well, I probably have them right in here. So the first thing you're going to want to do, obviously, it sounds like you've already set your latitude and longitude.
Correct.
And then when you're doing your design, you set your north pointer. And then do you use sun angles at all?
Yes, yeah, I'll place a sun angle line there and set it. I'll usually try to set it for earlier in the morning or later in the
Right,
afternoon time just to get a lower sun value, but it's often still feels very, very bright.
right. So in these sun angles, there is a lighting data panel.
Oh, okay.
And you can set the intensity of the lighting. There's a drop down of a handful of pre-configured ones. You can type in really any number. 100,000 in this example here is considered to be midday and probably as bright as you would expect. But you'll find settings that range much lower, and then you can even go lower than that. When I do a nighttime scene, obviously you can even, or an evening scene, you can turn that way down. But you might try looking at the setting for your sun intensity on that lighting panel and see if that works out for you.
Yeah, that seems exactly what I'm looking for. Thank you.
And Nikki, the other thing you can do is the color. Currently my color is white, but as you tap on the color, you can put a nice subtle colorization. Again, if you're trying to go for an evening shot, you might try adding a little bit of color in there to make some hints of evening or
Right.
morning.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for calling in today.
Scott, our next question is, can you demonstrate how to create a layer set so that we can add colors to our clay renderings one more time, please?
Yeah, I did a little bit of that in the presentation. And when you switch over and you take a 3D view, a lot of times if you look at the layer set, and I've opened up a clay render view here, you can turn on your active layer display, and I'll just open this up. And I've created a layer set called the 3D camera clay. And if I just kind of sort this based on color, I've colorized only a handful of things as I kind of highlight this. And in the presentation, a lot of times when you create a 3D view, your layer set might be just the 3D camera. And in the setting for the clay rendering, if I open up the render techniques, underneath the color panel for clay is the option to either use a solid color. If I change it to a solid color, you can change it to white or any color that you want as you just kind of click on this white panel in here. And then when you want to use the material color might be actual colors that you have for the cabinet or the flooring. I like to use a specific layer color. And that's what I've done with this 3D camera clay. And what I actually did underneath tools, you're going to find the option for your layer set management. And out of the box with Chief Architect, typically when you take a 3D view, it's going to be using a layer set called the 3D camera view. And if I make a copy of this 3D camera view, and I'm just going to call it, we'll just call it the Clay 2 version. So I've created a brand new layer set, and the default in here is just to use black. Typically these might be used for like a elevation render, so it's nice to have black lines. If you just select all, the first step that is maybe an easy one to do is just turn everything white. And then you can kind of come in here and pick and choose which elements you want to create as color. So if we come down and maybe colorize the base cabinets to be just maybe a subtle yellow. Let's just put a subtle yellow on the base cabinets. And then let's do a search for furniture. And I'm going to grab the interior furniture, and I'm going to maybe just use a subtle brown or light gray color. And we'll just kind of leave it with those two items. So the only two things that I've created in colorized would be the base cabinets and then the furniture. And now I have this new layer set that's available to me. And then when I close this panel, I can come over into my drop down and switch this over. So you can see the available camera set for Clay 2. And as this comes in sorted by color, I'm using the base and the interior furniture with these two colors. And let's see what happens when this view refreshes. So you can see that difficult to tell that the furniture, which would be the chair here, but you can see the base cabinets. You might even use this as a remodel project. You could put some of your cabinets that you're going to be including as new construction, colorize them, and then when you do your rendering, you could put all of the items that are going to be in the new construction on that color layer, and then it would be very easy to show your clients, here are the new components of your project. So hopefully that helps to understand how you could use those layers and combine it with the rendering and create some pretty unique renderings. I did a variation of this. If I just kind of grab a shot of the closet I was looking at earlier. So using the master closet in this case, again, to create a little bit of accent in here, you can create some pretty fun renderings. So hopefully that answers part of the question on how do you create a layer set for your renderings.
Thanks, Scott. We have a question from Nilufar. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Scott. I have a question about the line drawing. When I do 3D and I just want to send it to the layout, and when I send it, the line is not very crisp and sharp. And it doesn't show like a. And when I send it to my team, they were saying that even though we use the plot, when I want to send it, I do line drawing, and then I go to choose the plot or send it as an image to layout page. It doesn't look, the line is not very sharp. Is it
Okay,
any
so
setting that you would say that, because we don't to show to the client we use the 3D and like a ray tracing, but to create the layout page we do not use the real ray trace include that.
okay, so thanks for the question today. Are you using Chief Architect Premiere?
Yes.
Okay. And when you're sending these line drawings out to the layout, are they elevation views or are they perspective?
No, 3D. No, it's their 3D line drawing.
Okay. So if I convert this over to a line drawing and we take a look at some of the settings in here, let's go in and let's make sure that we're using a little bit thicker line drawing. And we'll just kind of crank this up a little bit so that we make sure that we get the setting. So when you are using your line drawing settings, is this the type of view that you're using?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And in your settings, have you adjusted, if I go into the technique options, have you adjusted under the effects category the thickness of the setting?
I did adjust it, and then let me just look at it myself. So Yeah, mine is like my thickness is like a 10.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And the like extended amount is 3, 15, and 10 if I go like that. And this is my, and then I go say, this is like always saved on my, and then I say send to layout. When it says send to layout, it has the option of the current screen or current screen as the image. Which one you would say that is the lines are sharper, or should I just do the updates always?
Let me just make sure I've reset my settings, and let's kind of walk through that. So I'm just going to set this thickness back to 5. So when you get ready to send a view like this out to your layout, any of the cameras like watercolor or line drawing, when you get ready to send these out to the layout sheet, these are considered live views. That's really
Yes.
the only option that you have. And there's 2 settings in here, update on demand and update always. I typically find that I use update on demand. It may require me to use the refresh, but it's less intensive time-wise as I'm working in the system. So I usually send these out as update on demand. And then when you send these out to your layout, let's go ahead and I opened up a quick layout here. And we'll send this out onto the sheet. And so here is the view. And then sometimes I saw a couple of questions come in. If I zoom way in, it appears to be fuzzy, right? So one of the things you can do is just tap on the view. If you print it, it will refresh, but there's also a forced refresh down in the lower left-hand section of my menu, and it says Update View. Because what's happening is I'm zooming in, I'm zooming out, and since that's not the update on demand or update always, it can get fuzzy in that view, and you can see that it does get crisper. Now the other thing, if I just press F6 on my keyboard to fill the screen, when I send this view out to the layout sheet, this is 24 inches by 36, so it's a pretty big sheet of paper. I don't have the ability to export this at a higher resolution to the layout sheet. So if you need to print it, is it after you print it that you find it's fuzzy, or is it while you're looking at it
No,
that it
when
may
I
be
turn
fuzzy?
when I turn it to PDF and I send it to whoever I have to send it.
Yeah. So at that point, one of the things that I do, since when I send this out to layout, there was no setting for the dots per inch on the resolution of the image. So a lot of times, and forgive me, may you, how do I pronounce your name correctly?
Nilu.
Milu. Okay.
Nilu, N with the N.
Okay, Milu. When I send an image out, and let me just grab an example here. When I send some of my renderings out onto the layout sheet, I will actually export the image and not send it directly to the layout. So I'll export it as an image. It's sitting on my computer folder, and then I drag it into the design. So I find when I do this, I get a more controllable resolution. So the steps that I typically do would be in the 3D view, you can come over and you can go export this as an image. Are you able to see my screen okay?
Yes.
Sometimes there's a little bit
Yes.
of a lag. So I'm going to export this as an image. And at this point, it asks me for what resolution that I want. So if you did a little bit of math and you said, gosh, it's 24 inches by 36 inches, and I wanted to print it at, when it actually prints out, I want to make sure that it's 12 inches by, 14 inches on the sheet. Well, you can come in here and do a little bit of math, but you have control over what the resolution is. So
Sure.
instead of using the active window size, which apparently my active window size is approximately just under 1700 by 850, you could crank this up to, 4096. It will scale, and then you can also control the resolution. And then when you export this, let me just figure out a place to put this. Let's put it on, sure, LD temp. So I'll just put this in my folder. Okay, so this takes a minute to export. It's going through and stitching all of the different images together because it's beyond the screen resolution. So I now have this in my folder because I've exported it. Then if I go back over into the layout, let's slide this one over. And then I'm going to come over into where I've exported that. So I've got that on my folder over here. And all I'm going to do is drag that into the design. And then I'm going to resize it. Pull it over here. Let's just pull this one off to the side a ways. You see the difference here?
That's true. Yeah, that's so much different. Yeah.
So I now have a lot more control over the resolution size and the dots per inch size. And so I don't typically, me personally, send those views directly out from the program. I usually export them. It does require more steps because if I come in and I say, oh gosh, that cook hood is all wrong, or I need to reconfigure something, it's more work because I have to then re-export, drag that into the layout, and do it that way. But you will have more fine control over the quality of that image going on your layout sheet.
Yeah, it does make sense. Thank you so much.
Okay. Hey, thanks for calling in.
Thank you.
Scott, we have Charles here. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question, Charles.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, Charles.
Hello, Charles from Texas. I have some client that took a picture from the site and they just sent them to me. I'm trying to make an entire rendering that I did, just lay it out on the picture.
Okay.
Can you show some sample or example if it's possible so I can kind of supercompose everything over on the existing land, how it's going to look like for a presentation?
So Charles, let me make sure I understand your question here. Your client has given you a picture of an existing house or an existing lot?
No.
Oh.
Existing lot, and this is right by the waterfront actually. So I told him what angle, stand there, just give me a nice picture. They text to me from his iPhone, and I import it to my thing. I'm trying to lay it out,
right,
make it sit like in the background.
Okay, so you want to use it to make it realistic when you take a 3D render that you can see what the new design will look like with that backdrop. Yeah, okay, sure. Let me just close a couple things here. And let me switch this just to a standard view. And we'll maybe use this design here as a quick example. And let's rotate around here just a little bit. Okay. So I've got a backdrop in here, right?
Yes.
And do you know how to import a backdrop and make those things happen, or is that what you're kind of interested in? Is how would I make this happen?
Please show me how to happen. I think I made a mistake.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, sure. So let's assume that you have this picture, and a lot of times what I do is I'll take those pictures and I'll kind of put them in a folder for the client. And then when I have that, then I'll import them. So let me see if I have a example here of a backdrop that I can quickly show you. I just did a quick search for a photo that I have. And if I open up this photo, here's a waterfront scene. Okay.
Right.
So it's just a picture that may have come from somebody's phone, right? And what I'm going to do to make this happen is inside my library, a lot of times what I'll do is I might have a specific folder for backdrops. So here's a quick backdrop folder that I have, and anywhere in your user catalog, whether it's a specific folder or just at the highest level at your user catalog, just right click. Okay, and then underneath the new, come down and choose the option to import a backdrop.
Okay.
You see that? Yep.
Yes.
And when you do that, it's going to kind of open up to some folder. And let me just grab this. Let's see if there's a good one in here. Okay, so here's a sunset view, right? So I'm going to grab this photo. So that now comes in, and I can give it a name, in this case, Lake Sunset. And there's an option if it's a spherical image. This one is not. So that then goes into my folder, right?
Yes.
Okay, so at that point, you can click inside the window. So grab your photo, and I'm still in the house, and I'm technically looking through a window or a door here. And if I click inside of that backdrop, then it will then apply that into the scene.
Oh, sweet.
Does that work?
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
I'm doing it at the same time I'm doing it. It happened, yes.
Okay, great.
Very good.
Okay.
Yes, thank you very much. I have a lot of other questions, but I'm just stop here. When is
Okay.
13 is going to be released?
Well,
2013.
you can, sure. So you can download X13 today as long as you are a current customer.
Yes,
And
I am. Okay.
also your SSA needs to be valid through, let me just grab this here. Where is that? Needs to be valid through end of June. And then when you go to your digital locker, you can just say, get the new version. When you do that, the system's going to
Right.
say if you want to upgrade, you can still
Yes.
use both versions. And then there's a little download button, and you can use it right away.
Okay. Thank you
Okay?
very much.
You
I enjoy
bet.
your show a lot. Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks for calling in, Charles.
Thank you.
Scott, we had Jesus write in and he was wondering, how can you make it so there's a reflection showing in the windows?
In the windows. Okay. So typically when you have reflections, I'll just kind of make sure that I can fully show this. And I'm just going to grab, I'm looking at my other monitor, so I apologize. I've got a lot of screens that are taken up. When you have reflections, and let me see if I can grab the bath here. Yeah, okay, let me just open this. There's a couple of things with reflections. In this case, this is a bathroom scene with a mirror, and there's a specific setting for reflections that will show up with mirrors. But other reflections, like the bathtub has water in it, as well as the sinks are glass, or even the glass on the showers, those reflections happen automatically depending on your sunlight and your other lights available and how it bounces around in your room. So if you're looking for reflections, and we kind of back out, let me close the library here. And let me switch my view back into maybe the physically based view. So let me toggle back over here. This will take just a second with the laptop I'm running. So with reflections with glass, as this kind of refines itself, we're getting a lot of red in here from the sunset. If you take a look at this, it's one of the advantages when you change the backdrop, that you can see how bright that is. It almost looks like it's on fire. But as you look at some of the reflections with the glass, so this setting happens, and there is a specific option if you actually had mirrors in here. If we click on the edit information, there's a specific setting in here for reflections. That's mainly for things like mirrors. In fact, we could probably call that reflections for mirrors. But I'm still getting reflections out of the glass, and as long as you have light and or sun information, you should be getting those reflections, and it should happen automatically depending on your render view. Again, this is the physically based view that I have set up here. Let me just close this and I'll reopen it so I don't save it. It'll be a little bit better view that we'll be able to show. But those renders and reflections just happen. There we go. Grab that. Because of the light and the sun information that comes in. And so it's pretty easy to be able to generate that. Just make sure that you have one of the rendering techniques, like the physically based rendering technique, that will give you that information. So hopefully, Carrie, that answers the question about that.
Okay, great, thank you. We also had somebody write in, and in the case that you just showed where the red from the backdrop was displaying in the interior,
Yeah.
can you demonstrate how you might tone that down?
Yeah, one of the things that when you're setting up your scene, the physically based and the clay rendering that we talked about mainly today, they both support real-time ray tracing. And when you're modifying your settings, if we go into the technique options, there is a setting in here for the daytime backdrop intensity. Currently, I have this set at 1,000, and there are different recommendations for settings. I typically, when I'm using an interior render scene, use a backdrop intensity of 1,000. If we were using that sunset photo that I had imported earlier, I might turn that quite a ways down so that I'm not getting as much of the red in there. So that's a good way to look at that. There are a number of settings in here that you can change. The camera exposure will have effect on it. How bright is the sun? And your sun information is a separate setting. It can either be a specific, as I just open up the sun information, it can either be a generic sun. There was a lady that called in at the beginning that talked about light settings, and currently mine's at 500. And then you can also use a sun angle. And if you change the sun angle, the light data can be edited. But all of these things come into play to tone down the amount of light coming in and the color of light coming in. You may have noticed earlier that you can change the color of the sunlight too. So all of these things can have an effect upon your rendering, and specifically your backdrop information.
Great, thank you. I have one last question that was written in. How do I save a camera view once I have the renderings technique set up the way that I want? And is there a way of previewing them?
Okay, yeah. So right now, this is actually already a saved camera that I've opened. And if you kind of toggle back, I have a lot of saved cameras. You can see them in the plan view. In fact, let me just kind of fill my screen. I've got a whole bunch of cameras in here that are saved. One of the easiest ways you can kind of manage this is over in your project browser underneath cameras. I like to give these typically a pretty good name. So as you kind of want to open up one of these, if we just grab maybe the closet suite, any camera that you click and drag in your scene can be saved along with all of the settings that have been generated. And as we kind of move in and we open up and generate a new 3D view here, let me just grab this real quick. First of all, in X13, you can see a preview of this over in the preview panel over here. So as you click on the different cameras, you get a preview panel. The specific way that you'd save a camera once you generate the view is up here in your menu. You can come up underneath the 3D view, or since this is already a saved camera, you can just click on Save Active Camera, and then you can also give it a name. So in this case, I've just called it the Closet Suite number 1, and then you can save all the properties inside of this camera. And one of the things I sometimes will do, if you look at the different rendering techniques, and we kind of go through some of these, you can save all of the different rendering techniques settings. So if I toggle this over to be on the line drawing view, and this opens up, all of the settings in each of the views can then be saved with the camera, and then you can just toggle through the different cameras that you want and then recall it. As you close up the camera, you can recall it and then just double click on it to reopen it. So it's a great way to be able to save your cameras. You can save them by floor. So you can see that I have 2 floors in here. And then there are overviews. So if you're taking an overview from the outside, we just maybe click on this one before even opening it, right? You see the preview of it. If that's the camera you want, you just double click on it, and I'll just double click in this case, and then that will open up that camera. But this is a great way to see the preview, make sure that's what you want, and then open it up as you need to. But my point or my tip for you would be use good names when you save your cameras. That way it will be easy as you pull those up. The preview does help, however.
All right, Scott, I guess that's all we have for today. Did you have any announcements you wanted to make?
Hey, thanks everybody for attending today. I mentioned earlier, we have recorded this session. We'll send this out in the next day or so. And if you want to replay it, and also we'll have a link to a survey in there, we'd greatly appreciate any feedback. X13 is available today as a beta version. If you are a current customer and your SSA is valid through the end of June, you can go out and download it today. You can just see that in your digital locker. If you go to our website, chiefarchitect.com/what's new, you can learn about all of the new features that we put in the system. And as you kind of scroll down, there is an overview video of all of the new features. And then if you're only interested in specific things, today we've been talking about mainly presentation features. And you can specifically see what is brand new in Chief Architect X13 for presentation features. We've got this fun little graphic that we've been using from the scene today to show the difference between clay and the real-time ray tracing. And so you can learn about those things. At the very bottom of the page is the system requirements as I scroll all the way down towards the bottom here. So if you're trying to figure out, well, does my system work? If your system works today with X12, most likely it works today with X13. We have made some changes. The biggest one is if you want to do real-time ray tracing. It's not required, but if you do, it does require a little bit of a beefier video card, and you can learn about specifically what you need if you want to do the real-time ray tracing. Of course, that's only optional, but it's a great way to get really great renders in about 30 seconds. So you'll find the system requirements on the bottom of the page. If you're interested in attending more of our events, if we kind of go back to our events page, at the end of summer, of course, we probably don't want to talk about that much, but at the end of summer, we do have a virtual training event coming up for introductory and kitchen and bath classes. On-demand training is available anytime. And then we do have a boot camp. You'll find one of these on Friday, tomorrow at 10 a.m. This is a free offering. If you're new, this is a great way to kind of hit the ground running and learn about how the program works. And that will be starting up tomorrow. We'll be attending the Chief Academy next summer here in Coeur d'Alene. So that's an event coming up. I appreciate everybody attending today, and have a great day, everybody.